April 12, 1945. Washington, D.C. 5:12 p.m. Harry S. Truman is in the office of House Speaker Sam Rayburn, having a quiet drink after a long day in the Senate chamber. He is the Vice President of the United States, a position he has held for exactly 82 days. Nobody is paying much attention to him. The real power belongs to Franklin D. Roosevelt, resting at his retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia. Then the phone rings. The voice belongs to Steve Early, FDR's press secretary. The message is 4 words long: "Come to the White House." Truman arrives at 5:25 p.m. He is taken upstairs to Eleanor Roosevelt's sitting room. She places her hand on his shoulder. "Harry," she says, "the president is dead." Truman cannot speak for a moment. Then he finds his voice. He asks Eleanor if there is anything he can do for her. She looks at him, this small man from Missouri, this failed farmer, this failed haberdasher, this politician from a corrupt machine, this 60-year-old man who has been briefed on almost nothing of consequence, and she says, "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." She was right. At 7:09 p.m., with 35 people crowded into the cabinet room, Harry S. Truman raised his right hand and was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States. He did not know about the Manhattan Project. He did not know the United States had spent $2 billion building the most destructive weapon in human history. He did not know the war in the Pacific was approaching its savage climax. He did not know what Churchill was thinking. He did not know what Stalin had been promised at Yalta. He had been kept in the dark, deliberately, systematically, by a president who had not told his own vice president the secrets that would now become his burden. In the next 3 years and 9 months, this farmer's son from Missouri, this man who never went to college, this man who went bankrupt selling suits, would drop the atomic bomb twice, draw the line against Soviet expansion, launch the greatest economic rescue in human history, airlift food and coal into a blockaded city for 15 months, create the alliance that defended Western Europe for 70 years, desegregate the United States military, fight a war on the Korean Peninsula, and fire the most celebrated general in America for insubordination. And he would win a presidential election that every expert in the country told him he would lose. This is the story of Harry S. Truman, the man nobody expected, the president who built the modern world. The boy from Missouri, early life. Harry S. Truman was born on May 8, 1884, in Lamar, Missouri, a small town of barely 1,000 people. His father, John Anderson Truman, traded mules and livestock. His mother, Martha Ellen Young Truman, was a deeply religious, fiercely intelligent woman who had attended the Baptist Female College in Lexington and would shape her son's character more profoundly than anyone else in his life. The S in Harry S. Truman does not stand for anything. It was chosen deliberately to honor both his grandfathers, Anderson Ship Truman and Solomon Young, without favoring either one. Truman himself was inconsistent about whether it took a period. He usually used one. He thought it looked better. From the beginning, there were complications. Harry had severe hyperopia, farsightedness, discovered at age 6. Thick corrective lenses barred him from rough sports, separated him from peers who teased him, and pushed him inward toward books, music, and the piano. Martha Truman was a classical pianist who could read music before she could read words. She gave Harry lessons from age 5. He practiced 2 hours daily for over a decade, eventually playing Chopin and Liszt at a level that impressed genuine musicians. He loved reading even more. By age 13, he had read every book in the Independence Public Library, Plutarch's Lives, histories of ancient Greece and Rome, Napoleon and Wellington, Jackson and Grant. He was building, without knowing it, a strategic intelligence, the ability to see patterns in history, to understand how great men made decisions under pressure. This self-education from a small-town library would prove more useful in the presidency than any formal degree. Then the money ran out. His father speculated in grain futures and lost badly. By 1901, when Harry graduated high school, there was no money for college. His younger brother would go. Harry would not. He worked as a bank clerk in Kansas City, good with numbers, organized, reliable, and profoundly unhappy watching other people's money move through a ledger. In 1906, he left the bank and returned to the family farm in Grandview, Missouri. 600 acres, backbreaking work. He farmed for 11 years, kept meticulous books, read every agricultural journal he could find, and made modest profit. He was 30 years old, unmarried, living with his parents in rural Missouri. His future, by any conventional measure, looked finished before it had started. Then the war came. The soldier, How World War I Built Harry Truman, April 6, 1917. The United States enters World War I. Truman is 32, old enough to avoid service, with poor eyesight that should have disqualified him, needed on the family farm. There were 100 reasons not to go. He memorizes the eye chart before his physical examination and passes. He rejoins the Missouri National Guard and ships out for France in 1918, assigned to command Battery D of the 129th Field Artillery. Battery D had a reputation not for courage, but for chaos. These were Irish Catholic boys from Kansas City who had already driven off 2 commanders. Officers had broken down in tears managing them. The battery was, in plain language, a disaster. Truman was given command on July 11, 1918. He was 34 years old, wearing thick glasses, and had never commanded anything larger than a farm. The first night, Battery D staged a near mutiny, deliberately stampeding horses to test the new commander. He did not break. Standing in the chaos, Truman, who had spent his adolescence reading about Jackson at New Orleans and Grant at the Wilderness, who understood that command authority either existed completely or not at all, delivered a dressing down of spectacular force. Several sergeants were immediately busted to private. Battery D never gave him trouble again. In the months that followed, during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest American military operation in history, involving 1.2 million U.S. troops, Battery D provided direct artillery support for General George S. Patton's Tank Brigade. Under intense German counter-battery fire, Truman directed his men with precision and discipline. They held, they fired. They did not run. When the guns fell silent at 11:00 a.m. on November 11, 1918, Battery D had been firing until that final minute. The record is extraordinary. Not one man in Battery D died under Truman's command in France. In a war that killed 10 million soldiers, this artillery battery commander brought every single one of his men home alive. He returned to Missouri in May 1919. He was a different man. The farm boy had discovered something fundamental. He could lead. He could make hard decisions under pressure. He could keep men alive. 1 month later, on June 28, 1919, he married Elizabeth Bess Wallace, the girl he had loved since they were both 5 years old in Sunday school in Independence. He had proposed before the war. She had said no. He proposed again. She said yes. Whatever Truman lacked in polish and financial security, he more than compensated for in persistence. From haberdasher to senator, the political rise in November 1919. Truman and his Battery D supply sergeant Eddie Jacobson opened the Truman and Jacobson Haberdashery at 104 West 12th Street in Kansas City. Shirts, ties, belts, hats, socks, a good location, a good product. For 2 years, a modest success. Then the recession of 1921 hit. The agricultural depression crushed Missouri. Sales collapsed. The partners tried to hold on, reduced inventory, extended credit to customers who couldn't pay. In September 1922, the doors closed. Truman was nearly bankrupt, owing more than he could repay. Eddie Jacobson declared bankruptcy. Harry characteristically refused. He spent the next 15 years slowly, quietly paying every debt without protection, without legal relief, without asking anyone for help. It took 15 years, but he paid every cent. He was 38, no career, a wife and, on February 17, 1924, a daughter, Margaret, their only child, a closed business and a pile of debt. Then Thomas J. Pendergast called. Pendergast was the Democratic boss of Kansas City, the most powerful urban political machine in Missouri. He bought votes, rewarded loyalty, and crushed enemies. One of his nephews had served in Battery D, knew Truman, and vouched for him. In 1922, Pendergast offered Truman a chance to run for county court judge in Jackson County. Truman ran. He won. He was, at long last, a politician. The Pendergast connection would follow him forever. His opponents called him the senator from Pendergast. They weren't entirely wrong. He had entered politics through the machine. And he maintained personal loyalty to Pendergast, even after the boss was convicted of tax evasion in 1939. Truman attended Pendergast's funeral in 1945, while serving as vice president, ignoring the political damage. Asked why, he said simply, "He was always my friend and I have always been his." But the label was deeply unfair. As presiding judge of Jackson County from 1927 to 1935, Truman ran one of the most honest county administrations in Missouri history. He built roads. He built the county courthouse, completed on time and under budget. He hired by merit, fired incompetent contractors regardless of political connections, and kept himself scrupulously clean while everything around him was. In 1934, Pendergast directed him to run for the United States Senate. Truman won. He arrived in Washington as a freshman senator dismissed as a machine product. He proved them wrong spectacularly. In 1941, Truman noticed something alarming. The military construction program was riddled with waste and fraud. He went to the Armed Services Committee. They ignored him. He went to the Senate floor. Still nothing. So Harry Truman drove himself 30,000 miles around American military construction sites in his own car, personally investigating. Then he proposed the special committee to investigate the National Defense Program, the Truman Committee. He chaired it. Over 3 years, it uncovered billions in fraud and criminal profiteering. By the time it finished, the committee had saved the government an estimated $15 billion, roughly $260 billion in today's money. It is one of the greatest anti-corruption efforts in American legislative history. The man who had entered the Senate as the senator from Pendergast left it as one of its most respected members. By 1944, FDR was assembling his 4th presidential ticket. The incumbent VP, Henry A. Wallace, was too progressive for the party's powerful conservative wing. If Roosevelt won and died in office, Wallace would become president. The party bosses would not allow it. They wanted Truman, and what the bosses wanted, FDR needed. On July 21, 1944, Harry S. Truman was nominated for vice president. The ticket won with 432 electoral votes. On January 20, 1945, Truman was sworn in. He had been vice president for 82 days when the phone rang. The burden of secrets. Succession. The next morning after the swearing-in, Secretary of War Henry Stimson briefed the new president on the Manhattan Project, a secret $2 billion program. 130,000 people, dozens of sites across the United States, Canada, and Britain. The first atomic bomb would be ready within months. The decision to use it would belong to Harry Truman. He was simultaneously the least prepared and most honest man in the room. He asked the right questions. He demanded raw information, not summaries, not recommendations, everything. What he learned was extraordinary and terrifying. The Pacific War was in its final savage phase. At Iwo Jima, 6,821 Americans killed, 19,000 wounded to capture an 8-square-mile island. At Okinawa, 12,513 Americans killed, 38,916 wounded, a 35% casualty rate. 1 in 3 Americans who fought there was killed or wounded, and Okinawa was not Japan. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, projected conservative estimates of 250,000 Americans killed and over 1 million wounded in the first phase alone. Japanese casualties, millions. The Japanese government had already distributed spears and bamboo pikes to women and children with instructions to fight to the last person. Truman faced 4 options. Continued conventional bombing, already killing hundreds of thousands, Japan not surrendering. Ground invasion, the casualty estimates made him physically ill. A demonstration detonation over an uninhabited area. The interim committee concluded no demonstration was likely to end the war, and there were only 2 bombs, or direct use on a military-industrial city. Target selection excluded cities of unique cultural or religious significance. Truman would not destroy Japanese civilization. On July 17, 1945, the day after he arrived in Potsdam for the final Allied summit, he received a coded telegram. Babies satisfactorily born. The Trinity test had succeeded. The gadget had detonated with a yield of 21 kilotons. The fireball was visible from 200 miles. J. Robert Oppenheimer recalled the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Truman made his decision. He authorized the bomb. The bomb, the most consequential decision in history, August 6, 1945. Hiroshima, Japan, 8:15 a.m. The B-29 Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, flies at 31,060 feet over a city of 350,000 people, home to the 2nd Japanese Army and a major military supply depot. The sky is clear. The city is going about its morning routine. The bomb falls. It detonates at 1,900 feet above the Shima Surgical Clinic, 15 kilotons. The temperature at ground zero reaches 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 1 mile, every wooden structure is vaporized. The blast wave flattens everything that has not already burned. People at the epicenter are not killed, they are erased. Their shadows are burned into the stone pavement beneath where they stood. Beyond the blast zone, the heat ignites clothing and skin. People with flesh hanging in sheets stagger toward the river. Children push floating corpses aside to drink from the Oda River. The clear blue sky turns black, then red. By day's end, approximately 80,000 dead, another 35,000 injured. By the end of 1945, radiation will kill 60,000 more. Total Hiroshima death toll, approximately 140,000 people. Japan does not surrender. August 9, 1945. Nagasaki, 11:02 a.m. The boxcar drops Fat Man, a plutonium device, 21 kilotons. Death toll, approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people. On August 14, Japan surrenders. Emperor Hirohito broadcasts to his people, the first time most had ever heard his voice. He describes the atomic bomb as a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is, indeed, incalculable. World War II is over. The war that had killed between 50 and 85 million human beings, the most devastating conflict in recorded history, was finished. Truman was aboard the USS Augusta in the mid-Atlantic when he received news of the Hiroshima bombing. He said, "This is the greatest thing in history." He never apologized. He maintained, consistently and until his death, that the bomb had saved more lives than it took, that the invasion would have killed more people, on both sides, than both atomic bombs combined. Late in life, he said, he alone in all the world must say yes or no to that awesome, ultimate question. Every president since Harry Truman has had that power. None has exercised it. The sign on his Oval Office desk read, "The buck stops here." And at Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, the buck stopped with Harry Truman. Building the New World Order, Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, and NATO Europe in 1945 is a continent of ruins. Cities are rubble. Economies are shattered. Tens of millions are displaced and starving. Into the vacuum move two forces, American power from the West, Soviet power from the East. Stalin has installed communist puppet governments in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. In Greece, communist guerrillas are fighting a civil war. In Turkey, the Soviets are applying pressure for naval access. And in early 1947, Britain, exhausted and near bankrupt, announces it can no longer support either Greece or Turkey. The aid stops March 31, 1947. Truman faces a choice. Let both countries fall into the Soviet sphere or fill the gap. He fills the gap. March 12, 1947. Truman addresses a joint session of Congress. His voice is flat, Midwestern, unadorned, nothing like FDR's theatrical eloquence. But what he says is precise and unambiguous. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. This is the Truman Doctrine, the foundational document of American Cold War strategy. Not merely a $400 million aid request, a declaration. The United States will stand wherever Soviet expansion threatens free peoples. Every president from Eisenhower to George H.W. Bush would follow it for 43 years. Greece and Turkey do not fall. 2 months later, Secretary of State George C. Marshall delivers a commencement address at Harvard. On its surface, an academic speech. In substance, the announcement of the most ambitious economic program in human history. Marshall proposes American assistance to rebuild the devastated nations of Europe, all of them, including former enemies. The logic is strategic. Economic recovery produces political stability. Political stability prevents communist takeovers. April 3, 1948, Truman signs the Marshall Plan. Over 4 years, the United States appropriates $13.3 billion, roughly $140 billion today, for European recovery. France, West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium. Economies shattered in 1945 rebuild into prosperous modern industrial states within a decade. The Marshall Plan is, by any measure, the most successful foreign aid program ever undertaken by any nation in history. George Marshall receives the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953, and then NATO. April 4, 1949, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty in Washington. The key provision, Article 5, declares that an attack on one member is an attack on all. For the first time in American history, the United States commits itself, in a formal peacetime treaty, to the military defense of European nations. Critics called it a revolution in foreign policy, the abandonment of non-entanglement since Washington's farewell address. Truman did not disagree. In a world with atomic weapons and Soviet armies in the heart of Europe, isolation was not a policy. It was a fantasy. 75 years later, NATO remains the largest and most successful military alliance in human history. The Berlin Miracle, Airlift versus Blockade, June 24, 1948. At midnight, Soviet forces cut all rail, road, and water connections to West Berlin. 2 million people, sitting 110 miles inside Soviet-controlled territory, are surrounded. Stalin's calculation: the Western Allies cannot supply a city of 2 million by air alone and will be forced to either abandon West Berlin or make concessions. Stalin is wrong. Truman's response is immediate: no withdrawal, no negotiations under duress. The United States will supply the city by air. Operation Vittles begins June 26. American C-47 and C-54 cargo aircraft start flying into Tempelhof Airport. The problem is almost incomprehensible. West Berlin needs 4,500 tons of supplies daily: food, coal, medicine. Industrial materials, delivered by propeller-driven aircraft with limited cargo capacity, in an era before containerization. The Americans and British solve it through meticulous operational planning. At peak operation, aircraft land every 45 seconds. Every pilot follows identical approach routes, identical altitude, identical airspeed. No deviation. The maintenance crews work around the clock. The loading teams never stop. On April 16, 1949, the Easter Parade, the airlift delivers 8,893 tons in a single day. Final statistics: 278,228 flights, 2,334,374 tons delivered. 17 American and 8 British aircrew die in crashes. May 12, 1949. The Soviet Union lifts the Berlin blockade. 15 months, 2 million people kept alive. Stalin's gamble fails completely. The message to the world: the United States will not be intimidated. It will not abandon its commitments. It will find a way. The Berlin airlift is one of the greatest logistical achievements in military history, driven by the decision of one man, a former farmer from Missouri who never went to college, to simply refuse to give in. DWIDFEATSTRUMAN, the greatest election upset in American history, November 2, 1948, Election Day. The polls are clear. The experts are clear. The newspapers are clear. Thomas E. Dewey, polished governor of New York, former prosecutor, two-time Republican presidential candidate, is going to win. Every major polling organization has him ahead. The Chicago Daily Tribune is so certain that it begins printing its next morning's edition before the results are in. The headline, in enormous type: DWIDFEATSTRUMAN. Truman is not supposed to win. His approval rating has fallen below 40%. The Democratic Party is split 3 ways: a Southern faction under Strom Thurmond running on racial segregation, a progressive faction under Henry Wallace drawing votes from the left, a Republican Congress, and a press that is overwhelmingly hostile. And yet Truman campaigns with a ferocity nobody anticipated. He takes the train, 31,000 miles by rail, 32 states, 352 speeches. City after city, whistle stop after whistle stop, speaking bluntly and directly without notes, in the language of ordinary Americans who recognize something they rarely see in politicians. A man who actually means what he says. He attacks the Republican-controlled do-nothing Congress, not as abstract political argument, but as kitchen-table reality. Blocked housing, blocked labor protections, blocked civil rights, blocked fair wages. At one stop, a voice yells, "Give 'em hell, Harry." Truman grins. "I never give anybody hell. I just tell the truth about them and they think it's hell." The phrase catches fire. "Give 'em hell, Harry." The rallying cry of a campaign nobody believed could win. November 3, 1948. Dawn. State after state, Florida, Ohio, Illinois, every state the pollsters had assigned to Dewey goes to Truman. By early morning, the arithmetic is unmistakable. Harry S. Truman, 24,178,347 popular votes, 303 electoral votes. Thomas E. Dewey, 21,991,292 popular votes, 189 electoral votes. Strom Thurmond, 1,176,023 popular votes, 39 electoral votes. Henry Wallace, 1,157,328 popular votes, 0 electoral votes, against every prediction, against every poll. Against the full weight of the press, the expert class, and both party establishments. The photograph of a grinning Harry Truman holding the Tribune's erroneous headline is one of the most iconic images in American political history. It captures something essential about the man, the pure joy of a fighter who everyone counted out and nobody could count out. The greatest political upset in the history of American presidential elections. Civil rights. The first steps toward justice. This is both Truman's proudest achievement and his most complex legacy. Truman was born in Missouri in 1884, the son of Confederate sympathizers, raised in a community where racial segregation was simply the way things were. He had used racial slurs in private correspondence as a young man. He was, in the language of his era and upbringing, a product of the segregated South. And yet, in 1946, a series of violent attacks on black veterans returning from the Second World War shocked the nation. Black men who had fought under the American flag, who had bled and died in the same Pacific Islands and European forests as their white counterparts, were being beaten, mutilated, and lynched when they returned home. In one particularly horrific case, Sergeant Isaac Woodard Jr., still in his Army uniform, was taken off a bus by South Carolina police and beaten so severely that both his eyes were permanently blinded. Truman heard the details of Woodard's case. He was reportedly so disturbed that he could not sleep. He asked his Attorney General to investigate. He asked his staff for options. June 29, 1947. Harry Truman becomes the first sitting president to address the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, speaking from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to an audience of 10,000 people and millions more on radio. He says, "There is no justifiable reason for discrimination because of ancestry, or religion, or race, or color. We must not tolerate such limitations on the freedom of any of our people." His Civil Rights Committee issues a landmark report to secure these rights, recommending federal anti-lynching legislation, the abolition of poll taxes, and desegregation of the armed forces. Congress refuses to act. The Southern wing of the Democratic Party is furious. Truman pushes forward anyway. July 26, 1948. Truman signs Executive Order 9981. It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services, without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. With a stroke of his pen, Harry Truman desegregates the United States military. No more separate units. No more black soldiers commanded by white-only officer corps. No more segregated barracks, mess halls, or training facilities. Every American in uniform, regardless of race, is entitled to equal treatment under military law. It is the most significant civil rights action taken by an American president since Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. It is also, in its practical consequences, transformative. As the military desegregates and black soldiers serve alongside white soldiers and demonstrate identical capability, courage, and professionalism, the moral argument for segregation collapses from within. The military's desegregation becomes a preview of the broader civil rights movement, that will follow in the 1950s and 1960s. He also issues Executive Order 9980, banning discrimination in the federal civil service, making it illegal to discriminate in hiring or promotion in any federal government agency on the basis of race. Truman's civil rights record is incomplete. He could not overcome Southern Democratic resistance in Congress to pass federal anti-lynching legislation. He could not abolish the poll tax. He could not achieve the full agenda his committee had recommended. But what he did, desegregating the military, addressing the NAACP, banning discrimination in federal employment, was more than any president before him had done. And it laid the groundwork for everything that Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson would build upon in the following 2 decades. Korea, the Forgotten War, June 25, 1950, 4:00 a.m. Korean time. 100,000 North Korean soldiers, equipped with Soviet T-34 tanks and artillery, crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. The offensive is massive, coordinated, and devastating. The South Korean military, equipped with light infantry weapons and no tanks, collapses almost immediately. Within 3 days, the South Korean capital, Seoul, falls. Truman is at his home in Independence, Missouri, when the news reaches him. He flies back to Washington immediately. He says afterward, "I felt certain that if South Korea was allowed to fall, communist leaders would be emboldened to override nations closer to our own shores." Within 72 hours, Truman commits the United States to the defense of South Korea, authorizes American air and naval support, and then, on June 30, orders American ground forces into the fight. He does not ask Congress for a declaration of war. He calls it a police action under United Nations authority. The UN Security Council had passed a resolution condemning the North Korean attack and authorizing member states to assist South Korea. The Soviet Union, which would have vetoed the resolution, was boycotting the Security Council at the time over an unrelated dispute and was not present to cast a veto. Critics would later argue, with some validity, that this precedent of committing American forces to combat without a formal congressional declaration of war was constitutionally problematic. Truman's view was that the speed of the crisis required executive action, and that UN authorization was sufficient international legal basis. The early months are catastrophic. American forces, reduced by post-war budget cuts and poorly prepared for ground combat, are pushed back to the Pusan perimeter, a small defensive enclave in the southeastern corner of the Korean peninsula. The situation is desperate. Then General Douglas MacArthur, 70 years old, legendary, the supreme commander of UN forces, executes one of the most audacious military operations in modern history. On September 15, 1950, American forces make an amphibious landing at Incheon, a harbor with treacherous tides that military planners had called impossible. MacArthur insists it can be done precisely because the North Koreans believe it cannot. The landing succeeds. The North Korean lines, cut off from their supply routes, collapse. By October 1, South Korean forces cross the 38th parallel back into North Korea. By October 19, UN forces capture the North Korean capital, Pyongyang. Victory seems close. Truman and MacArthur meet at Wake Island on October 15, 1950. MacArthur assures the president that Chinese intervention is unlikely. If China enters the war, MacArthur says, American air power will destroy any Chinese forces that cross the border. MacArthur is catastrophically wrong. October 19, 1950. 300,000 Chinese People's Volunteer Army troops cross the Yalu River into Korea, secretly at night, without air cover, moving through mountain terrain that American reconnaissance had deemed impassable. They hit the UN forces from the north and west simultaneously in late November. The advance collapses. American units are surrounded, outnumbered, fighting in temperatures of -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The Battle of the Chasen Reservoir becomes one of the most brutal engagements in Marine Corps history. 30,000 Marines surrounded by 120,000 Chinese troops, fighting through sub-zero conditions for 17 days to reach the sea. The war that MacArthur had promised would be over by Christmas 1950 is, suddenly, a conflict that could last years and cost millions of lives. Truman faces the darkest moment of his presidency. His generals are telling him to authorize the bombing of Chinese bases in Manchuria. MacArthur is publicly advocating for the use of nuclear weapons. The Chinese offensive has driven UN forces back below the 38th parallel. The question, whether to expand the war into China or accept a limited war on the Korean Peninsula, is the most consequential strategic decision since the atomic bomb. Truman chooses the limited war. No bombing of China, no nuclear weapons, no expansion beyond Korea. MacArthur disagrees, publicly, repeatedly, in ways that directly contradict stated American policy and undermine Truman's authority as commander-in-chief. On March 23, 1951, without authorization, MacArthur issues a public ultimatum to China, threatening to expand the war if China does not accept UN terms. This directly sabotages a planned presidential peace initiative. A week later, he sends a letter to the Republican leader of the House of Representatives, openly criticizing the administration's Korea policy. It is, in the language of military law, insubordination. In the language of American constitutional law, it is a general challenging the fundamental principle of civilian control of the military that the founders had deliberately built into the Constitution. Truman, characteristically, does not hesitate. April 11, 1951, President Harry S. Truman relieves General of the Army Douglas MacArthur of all his commands. He replaces him with General Matthew Ridgway. The political fallout is immediate and savage. MacArthur returns to the United States to a hero's welcome. 7 million people line the streets of New York City for his ticker-tape parade, one of the largest crowds in the city's history. He addresses a joint session of Congress and says, in a line that rings down through history, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." Truman's approval rating falls. Republicans call for his impeachment. Polls show that the majority of Americans believe Truman was wrong to fire MacArthur. Truman does not waver. He says, "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was, but that's not against the law for generals. If it was, half to 3/4 of them would be in jail." History vindicates Truman completely. The principle at stake, civilian control of the military, the constitutional subordination of military commanders to elected civilian authority, is not a trivial procedural matter. It is the cornerstone of American democracy. No general, however brilliant, however celebrated, however popular, is above the authority of the elected president. Truman understood this with absolute clarity. He acted on that understanding regardless of the political cost. The Korean War continues. It grinds on for another 2 years after MacArthur's firing. An armistice is signed on July 27, 1953, 6 months after Truman leaves office. The armistice line runs roughly along the 38th parallel, where it started. Approximately 36,574 Americans are killed in the Korean War. An estimated 2 to 3 million Koreans, North and South, die. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers die. Korea is often called the Forgotten War, sandwiched between the epic sweep of World War II and the political catastrophe of Vietnam. But its strategic outcome is not nothing. South Korea survives. It remains today a prosperous liberal democracy and a major American ally. North Korea survives too, a brutal totalitarian state that, 70 years later, threatens the world with nuclear weapons it developed specifically because of the Korean War precedent. The war that Truman chose to fight and chose to keep limited produced a result he could live with, even if it satisfied no one. The fair deal and the final years, domestic legacy, while the foreign policy dramas played out on the world stage. Harry Truman was simultaneously fighting a domestic agenda that he called the fair deal, a direct descendant of FDR's New Deal, expanded and updated for the post-war era. His ambitions were large: national health insurance, federal aid to education, a comprehensive civil rights law, expanded public housing, higher minimum wages, expanded Social Security, and full employment policy. Congress, dominated by a coalition of conservative Republicans and Southern Democrats, blocked most of it. But not all of it. February 20, 1946. Truman signs the Employment Act of 1946, establishing that the federal government has a fundamental responsibility to maintain maximum employment, production, and purchasing power in the American economy, the first legal acknowledgement of Keynesian economics in American law. July 15, 1949. Truman signs the Housing Act of 1949, authorizing federal assistance for slum clearance and the construction of 810,000 low-cost public housing units, the largest federal housing program in American history to that point. October 26, 1949. Congress raises the federal minimum wage from 40 cents to 75 cents per hour, an increase of 87.5%, providing a meaningful income boost to millions of American workers. August 28, 1950. Truman signs expanded Social Security amendments, broadening coverage to an additional 10.5 million workers and significantly increasing benefit levels. These are not the transformative programs Truman had hoped for. National health insurance, perhaps his deepest domestic passion, was defeated by the American Medical Association and congressional conservatives. Federal aid to education was blocked by disputes over segregation. The civil rights agenda was gutted by the Southern Democratic bloc. But the programs that did pass were significant and durable. And there was one other domestic achievement of Truman's presidency that is easily overlooked amid the foreign policy dramas. He preserved the New Deal. When Republicans won control of Congress in 1946, there was serious talk of dismantling FDR's social programs, Social Security, the regulatory agencies, the labor protections. Truman fought, with the combative stubbornness that was his defining characteristic, to prevent it. He vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, a bill that significantly weakened labor union rights. Congress overrode his veto. But the fight itself sent a signal. The New Deal's legacy was not up for dismantling. And there was one more achievement that, on November 1, 1952, placed Truman in a category shared by only one other person in human history. The United States tests Ivy Mike, the world's first thermonuclear weapon, the hydrogen bomb. The device yields 10.4 megatons, more than 450 times the explosive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The fireball is 3 miles wide. The mushroom cloud rises to 57,000 feet. Only one other human being, the man who had ordered the atomic bomb dropped, had ever made the decision to build and test a weapon of such power. The same man who had authorized Hiroshima was now presiding over a weapon that made Hiroshima look modest. The nuclear age that Truman had inaugurated in 1945 was not going backward. It was accelerating into something he could barely have imagined when he made that first decision. The end of the presidency, and the verdict of history January 1953. Harry Truman leaves the White House. His approval rating stands at approximately 32%, one of the lowest in presidential history at the time of leaving office. The Korean War, the McCarthyite accusations of communist infiltration in his administration, corruption scandals involving several of his appointees, and the general exhaustion of 8 years of crisis after crisis have taken their toll. He declines to run in 1952. He is eligible. The 22nd Amendment, ratified in 1951, limits presidents to 2 terms, but its grandfather clause exempts Truman from that limitation. He could run. He chooses not to. He believes, with characteristic directness, that he has given the job everything he has. It is time to go home. He does not accept the customary lucrative post-presidential opportunities, the corporate boards, the speaking fees, the influence peddling that has enriched former presidents before and after him. He returns to his modest home at 219 North Delaware Street in Independence, Missouri, the same house he had lived in since his marriage to Bess in 1919. He draws only his military pension, $112.56 a month. He was so financially constrained that Congress eventually passed the Former President's Act in 1958, providing all ex-presidents with a pension, largely because Truman's visible financial difficulties were embarrassing the country. He writes his memoirs. He walks daily. He answers his own mail. He receives visitors, young politicians, historians, foreign dignitaries, with an openness and directness that his critics in the White House years had failed to notice. He is the same man he had always been. Blunt, curious, fiercely principled, entirely without pretense. Bess Truman, who had hated Washington with a passion and had always considered independence her real home, thrived. Their daughter Margaret had become a professional singer and later a journalist and author. History began to reassess him almost immediately. Scholars who studied his foreign policy, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, the Berlin Airlift, concluded, gradually and then overwhelmingly, that these were not the muddle-through improvisations of an accidental president, but a coherent strategic vision that had fundamentally reoriented American power in the world. The framework he built: containment of Soviet expansion, economic recovery for Western Europe, collective military defense through NATO, held. It worked. It worked for 40 years, until the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradictions in 1991. The atomic bomb decision remained, and remains, the most contested element of his legacy. Historians continue to argue about it. Was it necessary? Were there alternatives? Were the casualty estimates inflated? The debate has generated thousands of books, articles, and documentaries, and shows no sign of resolution. What is not debated is this: Truman made the decision. He made it consciously, fully informed of what the bomb would do. And he made it in what he believed, and what the military evidence supported, was the best interest of ending the war with the minimum total loss of human life. He never expressed regret. He believed he was right. Whether history agrees depends on which historians you read, and which assumptions you make about the Japan invasion that never happened. The Korean War, often called America's first limited war, established a precedent that shaped every subsequent American military engagement. The decision to fight but not to expand, to contain but not to win in the traditional sense, was controversial then and remains controversial. Truman's successors in Vietnam would grapple with the same agonizing constraints and reach, ultimately, much worse conclusions. The firing of MacArthur, which cost Truman so dearly in public approval, is now almost universally considered correct. The principle it upheld, civilian control of the military, is fundamental to democratic governance. A general who publicly defies the commander-in-chief during wartime is not a hero. He is a threat. Truman saw this clearly and acted on it. December 26, 1972. Harry S. Truman dies in Research Hospital in Kansas City, Missouri. He is 88 years old. He had been in declining health for several years. Bess is at his side. He is buried at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri. October 18, 1982. Bess Truman dies. She is buried beside him. Today, in poll after poll of historians and presidential scholars, Harry S. Truman ranks consistently among the 10 greatest American presidents, often in the top 5, alongside Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. A man who was one of the most unpopular presidents in American history when he left office is now celebrated as one of its most consequential. The sign on his desk had it right. The buck stops here. At Hiroshima, at Berlin, at the Korean Peninsula, at the 38th parallel, at the executive order that told the United States military that it could no longer treat its black soldiers as second-class citizens. Every time the buck stopped, every time history demanded that one man step forward and make the hard decision, Harry Truman stepped forward. The farmer who memorized the eye chart, the haberdasher who paid every debt without going bankrupt, the senator who drove 30,000 miles in his own car to investigate corruption, the vice president who served 82 days and then became the most powerful person on earth, the president who never gave anybody hell, he just told the truth, the man who built the modern world. If this story changed how you think about Harry Truman, if you saw that the man history remembers as one of America's greatest presidents was, in his time, one of its least loved, hit that like button. If you're new here, we cover every war, every president, every turning point that shaped the world we live in today. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And in the comments, I want your answer to this question. Was Harry Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki the right one? Or was there another way? There is no easy answer. There never was. The buck stopped with Harry Truman. Leave your answer below. We'll see you in the next.